The auction block stood in Millbrook's dusty town square like a judge's bench, and Sarah Hartwell tried not to think about what would happen when the sun went down. Her wrists were bound with coarse rope, the August heat shimmering off the wooden platform beneath her bare feet. Mrs. Hartwell's voice cut through the crowd like a whip crack. 19 years old, knows her letters, good for kitchen work or whatever else suits your needs. The men below snickered and made their crude comments about damaged goods. Sarah kept her chin up, spine straight. Don't cry, she told herself. Don't give them that satisfaction. Bidding starts at $20, the auctioneer called. Same as you'd pay for a decent horse. The price of a human soul, apparently. 30, someone shouted. 40. 50, the auctioneer raised his hammer. Going once at $50. From the back of the crowd, a weathered voice cut through the jeers. 75. Every head turned. 3 months earlier, the blood on the kitchen floor had dried to a rusty brown stain, and Sarah Hartwell scrubbed at it with trembling hands. Dawn light crept through the window, but it couldn't chase away the darkness that lived in this house. Proverbs 29 verse 15, Mrs. Gertrude Hartwell announced from the doorway, her voice cold as winter wind. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Sarah didn't look up from her scrubbing. The blood was her own, payment for yesterday's burned biscuits. Mrs. Hartwell always found scripture to justify her cruelty, as if God himself endorsed the leather strap she kept hanging by the door. Get that mess cleaned up, the older woman continued. Then tend the chickens, and if I find so much as one broken egg, she didn't need to finish. They both knew what would happen. The Hartwell Ranch stretched across Nebraska's harsh plains, but drought had turned the once green pastures to dust. Cattle stood hollow-eyed near dry creek beds, and the corn crop had withered to brown stalks. Bills piled up on the kitchen table like accusations. Feed store, banknotes, doctor's visits that couldn't bring back what was already lost. Sarah had been 12 when they took her in, orphaned when cholera swept through the county. Mr. Hartwell had been a kind man then, speaking gently of Christian duty and second chances, but he'd been dead 3 years now, and his widow's charity had curdled into something bitter as spoiled milk. Worthless girl, Mrs. Hartwell muttered, watching Sarah work. Eating our food, wearing our clothes, and what good have you ever done us? Nothing but trouble from the day you arrived. Sarah bit her tongue. She'd learned that speaking only made things worse. In town, folks whispered about Jake Morrison, the hermit rancher who lived 12 miles north, lost his wife and little daughter to cholera the same summer Mr. Hartwell passed. Some said the tragedy had broken his mind. Others claimed he'd just chosen solitude over the pain of caring again. That Morrison fellow came by yesterday, Mrs. Henderson had told her neighbor at the general store. Still looks like a man carrying the weight of the world. Reckon losing everything he loved near about killed him. Shame, the other woman replied. He was a good man before grief got hold of him. Sarah heard these conversations while running errands, invisible as furniture to the townspeople. They saw only what Mrs. Hartwell wanted them to see. A charity case, damaged goods, a burden graciously borne by a righteous widow, but Sarah noticed things others missed. She saw how Jake Morrison's hands were gentle with spooked horses, how he paid his bills in silver without complaint, how he tipped his hat to every woman he passed, even the ones who whispered about his peculiar ways. The morning routine never changed. Sarah woke before dawn, built the fire, started breakfast. Mrs. Hartwell would find fault. Too much salt, not enough, biscuits too brown or not brown enough. The leather strap would sing its familiar song, and Sarah would swallow her cries. This particular morning, disaster struck when Sarah heard the milk cow bellowing in distress. She rushed outside to find the animal tangled in broken fence wire, bleeding from deep cuts. By the time Sarah freed her and tended the wounds, smoke was pouring from the kitchen window. The biscuits were charcoal. You worthless, clumsy girl. Mrs. Hartwell's hand cracked across Sarah's face. Can't even manage simple cooking. The strap came down 6 times. Sarah counted each blow, holding on to the numbers like prayer beads. 6. At least it wasn't 10 like last week. Maybe I should just sell you to them debt collectors, Mrs. Hartwell hissed. Let them find some use for you. That evening, as Sarah tended her fresh welts with cold water, she heard the sound that turned her blood to ice water. Hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. 3 riders crested the hill at sunset, their horses lathered with sweat. Hard men with cold eyes and guns on their hips, the kind of men who collected debts in blood when silver wasn't available. Mrs. Hartwell met them on the porch, her voice carrying through the open window. "I told you I need more time. The harvest." "Time's up, lady," the lead rider interrupted. "Mr. Kowalski wants his money. All of it. Or we start taking payment in other ways." Sarah pressed herself against the kitchen wall, heart hammering. Through the window, she saw one of the men's eyes linger on the house, calculating. "What about the girl?" he asked. Mrs. Hartwell's silence stretched like a rope about to snap. Back at the auction block, every face in the crowd had turned toward the stranger who just bid $75. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the gathering, hat pulled low, but shoulders square. He was tall and lean, with the kind of steady presence that made others step aside without being asked. The auctioneer's hammer trembled in his grip. 75 going once, twice. "Sold to Mr. Morrison." Mrs. Hartwell's relief was so obvious it might as well have been painted on a sign. She practically ran to collect the silver dollars Jake counted into her palm, each coin ringing against the others like tiny bells of freedom. "Much obliged, Mrs. Hartwell," Jake said quietly. "I'll take good care of her." "See that you do," the widow replied, but her eyes were already calculating how far $75 would stretch against her mountain of debt. Sarah stood frozen on the platform, watching money change hands. Another owner, another set of rules to learn, another chance for kindness to turn cruel. She'd heard the stories about men who bought women for purposes that had nothing to do with kitchen work. Jake approached the platform with slow, careful steps, the same way he might approach a spooked horse. "Come on down, miss," he said gently. "Let's get you out of this heat." His wagon was simple but clean, with a canvas cover to provide shade. He helped Sarah up with a respectful hand on her elbow, then climbed up beside her. As they rolled away from town, she waited for the commands, the warnings about what would happen if she displeased him. Instead, Jake asked, "You thirsty? Hungry? Need to stop for anything?" Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. "No, sir." "Name's Jake. Jake Morrison. What do folks call you?" "Sarah, sir. Sarah Hartwell." "Well, Sarah, my place is about an hour's ride. Not much to look at, but it's peaceful, quiet." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Jake didn't seem to need constant talk like some men. He let the wagon wheels and horse hooves provide the only conversation, occasionally pointing out a hawk circling overhead or a patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived the drought. "That there's Indian paintbrush," he said, nodding toward a splash of red among the brown grass. "Folks say it only grows where good things happened. Don't know if that's true, but it's pretty to think about." Sarah found herself studying his weathered hands on the reins. They were careful hands, she noticed, gentle with the horses, respectful of the harness leather. Not the hands of a man who took things by force. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, they turned up a dirt road that led to a modest ranch house. It wasn't grand like some of the big spreads, but everything looked well maintained. The fence posts stood straight, the barn doors hung true, and someone had planted flowers by the front steps. "Here we are," Jake said, setting the brake. "Home." He led her inside, and Sarah's eyes went wide. The house was clean but lived in, with furniture that looked handmade and sturdy. Books lined one wall, and a stone fireplace dominated another. It felt like a place where people had been happy once. "This here's your room," Jake said, opening a door off the main hallway. Inside was a simple bed with a quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a wardrobe against the far wall. "Locks on the inside," he added, nodding toward the door. "For your privacy." On the bed lay a clean dress, worn but carefully mended, and a bar of soap that smelled like lavender. Sarah touched the fabric with wondering fingers. When was the last time she'd worn something that wasn't patched and repatched? "You can wash up, change clothes, rest if you need to," Jake continued. "Supper's in an hour, but don't feel obliged if you're not hungry." Sarah found her voice. "What? What do you want me to do?" Jake paused in the doorway. "Well, there's always work on a ranch, cooking, cleaning, tending animals, but nothing you can't handle. and nothing that requires a strap to motivate you. His eyes met hers. Nobody's gonna hurt you here, Sarah. That's a promise. After he left, Sarah stood alone in the room that was apparently hers. She tested the door lock. It worked. She examined the dress. It would fit. She touched the soap. It was real. Then she opened the wardrobe to hang up the dress and froze. Inside, carefully preserved and smelling of cedar, hung a small blue dress with tiny pearl buttons. A child's Sunday dress, sized for a girl of maybe 8 or 9. Above it, on the shelf, sat a carved wooden horse and a rag doll with yellow yarn hair. Sarah's hands trembled as she touched the little dress. The fabric was soft, expensive, lovingly cared for. This wasn't just any child's clothing. This belonged to someone special, someone cherished, someone who would never wear it again. Sarah woke before dawn, as she had every morning for 7 years. Her body knew no other rhythm. She dressed quietly and crept toward the kitchen, expecting to find a list of chores or perhaps Jake himself, ready with orders for the day. Instead, she found him at the stove, cooking eggs and bacon. He looked up when she entered, nodding toward the table where 2 place settings waited. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee's fresh." Sarah hovered near the doorway, uncertain. At the Hartwell place, she'd eaten scraps and leftovers, usually standing at the sink. She'd never sat at a table like an equal. "Go ahead," Jake encouraged. "Food's better when it's hot." The eggs were perfectly cooked, the bacon crisp but not burned. Real butter on fresh bread, and coffee that didn't taste like it had been made with yesterday's grounds. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite while Jake read a letter that had arrived with yesterday's mail. "Ranch work's different from town work," Jake said, folding the letter. "Takes some getting used to, but I reckon you're capable enough." The next few hours revealed a new world to Sarah. Jake didn't bark orders or expect her to read his mind. Instead, he demonstrated each task patiently: how to scatter feed for the chickens without startling them, how to check for eggs with gentle hands, how to milk the cow with steady pressure that didn't cause pain. "Animals know when you're afraid," he explained as Sarah approached the milk cow cautiously. "They feel what you feel. Stay calm, move slow, and they'll trust you." The cow's name was Bessie, and she had kind brown eyes that reminded Sarah of her mother. As Sarah learned the rhythm of milking, Bessie stood patiently, occasionally turning her great head to watch with what looked like approval. "She likes you," Jake observed. "Bessie's particular about who she lets close." By afternoon, Sarah found herself actually enjoying the work. The animals didn't judge her or find fault with her efforts. They simply accepted her presence, and gradually, her touch. The chickens clucked contentedly when she gathered eggs. The barn cat wound around her ankles, purring. That evening, Jake lit a lamp in the main room and pulled a book from the shelf. Sarah watched him read, marveling at the peace on his face. The silence felt comfortable instead of threatening. Her eyes wandered to a small photograph on the side table, a woman with kind eyes and a little girl with Jake's stubborn chin, both dressed in their Sunday best. "That's Mary and Emma," Jake said, noticing her gaze. "My wife and daughter." "They're beautiful," Sarah whispered. "Cholera took them 3 summers back." Jake's voice was steady, but Sarah heard the pain underneath. "Struck fast. One day, Emma was laughing and chasing fireflies, and 3 days later," he cleared his throat. "Doc said there was nothing to be done. Sometimes, sickness just wins." Sarah studied the photograph, seeing love in every detail. The little dress in the wardrobe, it was hers. Jake nodded. "Mary made it special for Emma's 8th birthday. Never had the heart to pack it away. Maybe that makes me foolish." "No," Sarah said softly. "It makes you a father who loved his daughter." Something shifted in Jake's expression, like clouds parting to let sunlight through. "What about your folks? You remember them much?" "Some. Pa worked the railroad before the cholera got him. Ma made the best apple pie in 3 counties. Sarah smiled at the memory. "She used to say that anything broken could be fixed with enough patience and the right touch." Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Sarah's smile faded. "Sometimes I wonder what they'd think of what I became. A burden. A charity case." "You're not either of those things," Jake said firmly. You're a young woman who survived more than most folks twice your age. That takes real strength. The next morning brought disaster. Sarah was preparing breakfast when the skillet slipped from her trembling hands, sending eggs splattering across the floor and filling the kitchen with smoke from burned bacon. She dropped to her knees, frantically trying to clean the mess while bracing for the inevitable punishment. Sarah. Jake's voice was calm. What happened here? I'm sorry, she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I was trying to be careful. I don't know how. Hey. Jake knelt beside her, his voice gentle as summer rain. It's just eggs. Happens to everyone. Sarah looked up at him through her tears, waiting for the blow that didn't come, the harsh words that never came. Let's clean this up together, Jake said. Then we'll try again. That's when Sarah broke completely, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming shock of kindness without conditions. She sobbed like a lost child, years of suppressed anguish pouring out while Jake sat quietly beside her, offering his presence without judgment or impatience. When the tears finally stopped, Jake handed her a clean towel. Feel better? Sarah nodded, embarrassed but somehow lighter than she'd felt in years. Good. Now let's see about that breakfast. Later that evening, Jake tended to the old scars on Sarah's hands with a gentle salve that smelled of healing herbs. His touch was careful, respectful, asking permission before treating each wound. Why are you being good to me? Sarah whispered. Jake paused in his ministrations. Maybe because someone needs to be. Maybe because you deserve it. He met her eyes. Maybe because helping you helps something broken in me too. Through the window, Sarah saw riders approaching in the distance, 3 men on horseback, their faces grim with purpose. Sheriff Tom Dawson sat uncomfortably on Jake's porch, his hat in his hands, and duty warring with friendship in his weathered face. The 2 men beside him, Deputy Walsh and Council Chairman Berger, wore expressions of righteous certainty that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. Jake, you know I don't like bringing this to your door, Sheriff Dawson began, his voice heavy with reluctance. But there's been talk. What kind of talk? Jake's voice remained level, but Sarah noticed his hands tighten on the porch railing. About your arrangement with the Hartwell girl. Chairman Berger's tone dripped disapproval like sap from a wounded tree. People are concerned about the propriety of the situation. Are they now? Jake's words weren't a question. A man living alone with an unmarried woman, Deputy Walsh added, puffing himself up with self-importance. Folks wonder about your true intentions. Sarah pressed herself against the kitchen window, listening to her fate being decided by men who saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be protected. My intentions, Jake said slowly, each word measured like gunpowder, are to provide shelter and honest work to someone who needed both. Nothing more, nothing less. Nevertheless, Chairman Berger continued, consulting a piece of paper he'd pulled from his vest, the town council feels it would be appropriate for you to reconsider this arrangement. Perhaps find the girl a position with a proper family. The widow Morrison, for instance, could use help with her wash. Sarah's blood ran cold. She'd heard about Widow Morrison's help, girls who disappeared into that house and emerged months later, hollow-eyed and broken. Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably. Jake, I've known you 15 years. You're a good man. But appearances matter, especially when it comes to young women of uncertain reputation. Uncertain reputation? Jake's voice carried a dangerous edge. Based on what exactly? Well, Deputy Walsh stammered, she was raised by the Hartwell woman, and everyone knows how that turned out. Bad blood tells, if you take my meaning. After the men left with their warnings and ultimatums, Jake found Sarah in the kitchen, her face pale as winter sky. You heard, he said. Yes. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should. You should nothing, Jake interrupted with quiet ferocity. This is your home now if you want it to be. But that night, while Jake worked in the barn, Sarah made a terrible discovery. Hidden in his desk while dusting, she found legal papers that made her blood run cold. The contract Jake had signed didn't just purchase her labor, It gave him legal ownership of her services for 2 full years. Owned. Again. Fear clawed at her throat as the old familiar panic returned. Even kindness could be a cage if the key belonged to someone else. The contract spelled it out in black ink. She was bound to Jake Morrison for 24 months, with penalties for early termination that would land her in debtor's prison. That night, when Jake was asleep, Sarah gathered her few belongings and fled into the darkness. She made it 3 miles before collapsing from exhaustion on the open prairie. The stars wheeled overhead like distant, uncaring eyes as she lay gasping in the grass, nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Coyotes howled in the distance, and Sarah wondered if that would be her end, alone on the plains, food for scavengers. Dawn found her there, and so did Jake. Sarah. His voice was gentle as he knelt beside her frost-covered form. "What are you doing out here?" "I found the papers," she whispered through chattering teeth. "The contract. You own me for 2 years." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the pale morning light. "Is that what you think this is about?" "I don't know what to think anymore." Jake helped her to her feet, his touch careful and respectful. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Those papers, they're legal protection for you, not chains. If anyone tries to claim you owe them money or service, I can show them that contract and tell them to go to hell." "But you could." "I could do a lot of things. I could demand you work from dawn to dusk. I could lock you in your room. I could treat you worse than Mrs. Hartwell ever did." Jake's eyes met hers. "But I won't. You can leave anytime you want. The contract comes with you if you go, or I'll tear it up right now if that's what you prefer." Sarah stared at him, searching his face for deception and finding only steady honesty. "Because a person's word should mean something, and I gave you my word that nobody would hurt you here." They rode home in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, understanding instead of uncertainty. As they approached the ranch, Sarah saw 3 riders waiting in the yard, and her heart sank. The same debt collectors who had visited Mrs. Hartwell. The leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, touched his hat brim in mock politeness. "Morning, Morrison. We're looking for something that belongs to the Hartwell woman." The standoff in Jake's yard stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. Kowalski and his men sat their horses with casual menace, while Jake stood on solid ground, Sarah slightly behind him. The morning sun cast long shadows that seemed to emphasize the gulf between civilization and savagery. "Like I said," Jake repeated, his voice steady as bedrock. "Can't help you." Kowalski's eyes flicked to Sarah, and she felt his gaze like cold fingers on her skin. "Funny thing about debts, Morrison. When folks can't pay in silver, we get creative about collecting. Sometimes a pretty girl's worth more than whatever's written in some ledger book. Sometimes men who threaten women on my property find themselves in need of a doctor," Jake replied quietly, his hand resting casually near the rifle leaning against the porch post. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. After a moment that felt like an hour, Kowalski laughed and wheeled his horse around. "We'll be seeing you again, Morrison. Count on it." After they left, Jake turned to Sarah. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "What did he mean about Mrs. Hartwell's debts?" "Nothing good." Jake's jaw was tight with controlled anger. "Those aren't the kind of men who settle for partial payments or empty promises." That afternoon brought a different kind of trouble. Sarah accompanied Jake to town for supplies, and the reception was colder than a Nebraska winter. Mrs. Henderson, who'd always been polite before, turned her back when Sarah approached the counter. Other women whispered behind their hands, casting disapproving glances that felt like physical slaps. At the general store, Mr. Peterson hemmed and hawed before finally saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but some of my customers have expressed concerns about serving folks in your particular situation." "What situation is that?" Jake asked mildly, though Sarah heard steel beneath the calm words. "Well, you know, an unmarried man and woman living together under the same roof. It sets a poor example for the young people, and my wife feels the money's good and my business is legal," Jake interrupted. "Sell me what I need, or I'll take my trade to Omaha." Peterson reluctantly filled their order, but the damage was done. Word would spread that Jake Morrison was becoming difficult, argumentative, all because of that Hartwell girl. The church social that Sunday drove the point home like a nail in a coffin. Sarah had hoped to attend, to show the community she wasn't the shameful creature they imagined. Instead, she found herself standing alone near the refreshment table while conversation died around her like flowers in frost. "Did you see how she looked at Reverend Miller?" one woman whispered to another, not bothering to lower her voice. "Bold as brass, no shame at all. I heard Morrison bought her like a horse at auction. What kind of Christian man does such a thing?" "The kind who's been alone too long, if you ask me." Men get peculiar ideas when they don't have proper guidance. Sarah felt each word like a physical blow. When Jake appeared at her elbow, she was ready to flee. "We should go," she whispered urgently. "Not until we've said our piece to the Reverend," Jake replied. But Reverend Miller was deep in conversation with the church ladies, and his glance toward Sarah and Jake was far from welcoming. Jake took Sarah's arm and led her toward the door. Sometimes the quickest way out of a pit is to stop digging. That evening, while Jake was repairing fence posts damaged by the previous night's windstorm, Sarah made a discovery that changed everything. Searching through papers Mrs. Hartwell had left behind in her haste to complete the auction, she found records that made her stomach turn. The widow hadn't just been stealing from the church collection plate. She'd been forging documents, selling cattle that belonged to her creditors, and skimming money from every transaction she could manage. The evidence was damning. Altered receipts, falsified bills of sale, bank deposits that didn't match the recorded amounts. But it was the letter hidden in the very bottom of the box that stopped Sarah's heart entirely. Written in a shaky hand and dated 7 years ago, it was addressed to Mrs. Hartwell from someone named William Hartwell, but the content made no sense if he was writing to his wife. "Gertrude," it began, "I know you'll never forgive me for what happened with Clara. The shame of it burns in me every day. But the child isn't to blame for my sins. She's innocent of any wrongdoing, and I pray you'll find it in your heart to treat her with the kindness any child deserves. Sarah is my blood, but she's also just a frightened little girl who needs someone to care for her. Promise me you won't let your anger toward me poison your treatment of her." Sarah's hands trembled as the words sank in like stones into still water. Mrs. Hartwell hadn't been her benefactor's wife caring for his ward. She'd been his widow, forced to raise the living reminder of his adultery. Every beating, every cruel word, every moment of deliberate humiliation suddenly made horrible sense. Sarah hadn't been punished for burning biscuits or spilling water. She'd been punished for existing, for breathing, for having the audacity to survive when her very presence was a constant reminder of betrayal. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her revelation. Through the window, she saw Mrs. Hartwell herself riding up to the ranch, her face twisted with an expression Sarah had never seen before. Not just anger, but something approaching murderous rage. Behind her rode Kowalski and his men, and this time they weren't here for polite conversation. Mrs. Hartwell dismounted from her horse like an avenging angel of Old Testament wrath, her black dress billowing in the prairie wind. Sarah clutched the damning letter to her chest, understanding flooding through her like ice water through her veins. "I know you're in there, you little bastard!" Mrs. Hartwell shrieked toward the house, her voice carrying across the plains like a war cry. "Come out and face what you are!" Jake emerged from the barn, his face dark with controlled fury. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're not welcome here." "Not welcome?" The widow's laugh was harsh as a crow's caw, sharp enough to cut glass. "That's rich, considering you're harboring stolen property." Kowalski and his men flanked her, hands resting casually on their gun handles. The debt collector's scarred face wore an expression of professional interest, like a butcher sizing up a side of beef for the best cuts. "And now," Kowalski said smoothly, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of a snake oil salesman. "Let's keep this civil. We're just here to collect what's owed. Nothing more." Sarah forced herself to step onto the porch, the letter still clutched in her trembling fingers. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes fixed on her with undisguised hatred that seemed to radiate heat like a forge. "There she is," the widow hissed through clenched teeth. "The devil's own spawn, dressed up in decent clothes like she deserves them." "What's this about?" Jake demanded, positioning himself between Sarah and the mounted men like a human shield. Mrs. Hartwell's smile was as cold as a snake's belly, as cruel as winter wind. "Oh, you don't know, do you? You think you rescued some poor orphan girl. You have no idea what kind of creature you've been sheltering in your home." Sarah's voice came out as a whisper that somehow carried across the yard. "I found the letter." The widow's face went white as fresh snow, then flushed red as spilled blood. "You had no right." "The letter from your husband," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The one where he confesses that I'm his daughter, his bastard daughter." Jake's head snapped toward Sarah, confusion and dawning understanding warring on his weathered face like storm clouds gathering. "That's right," Mrs. Hartwell snarled, her voice rising to a shriek that sent birds flying from nearby trees. "The precious little orphan isn't an orphan at all. She's the bastard child of my husband's Irish whore, left on my doorstep like unwanted baggage when her real mother died of shame and consumption." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each one designed to wound, to diminish, to destroy. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her place in the world, crumbled in an instant like a house built on sand. She wasn't a charity case taken in by kind strangers. She was the living reminder of betrayal, the evidence of adultery that had poisoned a marriage from the moment she drew breath. "Every day, for 7 years," Mrs. Hartwell continued, her voice rising to a pitch that seemed to scrape the sky itself, "I had to look at her face and see his sins staring back at me. Every meal I fed her, every stitch of clothing I put on her back, was a reminder that my husband preferred some Irish trollop to his lawful, Christian wife." Sarah sank to her knees on the porch boards, the weight of revelation crushing her spirit like a boulder. The beatings, the cruelty, the constant reminder that she was worthless, it all made horrible, twisted sense now. She hadn't been punished for burning biscuits or spilling water, or any of the thousand small infractions that had earned her the strap. She'd been punished for the unforgivable crime of existing. "That's enough," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet, carrying the kind of calm that comes before the storm breaks. "Is it?" Mrs. Hartwell's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. 7 years I paid for his sin. 7 years I fed and clothed and sheltered the proof of his betrayal. And now she thinks she can run away and play house with you? She's poison, Morrison. Everything she touches turns rotten." Sarah struggled to her feet, her legs unsteady as a newborn colt's. I should go. Jake, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this." "You're not going anywhere," Jake said firmly, then turned to face Mrs. Hartwell with the kind of cold fury that made strong men step back. "Your husband made a choice. A wrong choice, maybe. That doesn't make it her fault." "Choice?" The widow's laugh was bitter as wormwood, sharp as broken glass. "He destroyed our marriage for a piece of Irish trash and left me to raise the evidence. Do you know what it's like to look at a child every day and see your husband's betrayal staring back at you?" "I know what it's like to lose a child," Jake replied quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old grief. "And I know it doesn't give you the right to torture an innocent one." Mrs. Hartwell's face twisted with rage so pure it seemed to transform her into something inhuman. "Innocent? She's sin made flesh. She's corruption walking on two legs. She's a young woman who survived 7 years of your cruelty," Jake interrupted, his voice cutting through her hysteria like a blade. "That makes her stronger than you'll ever be." Kowalski cleared his throat, reminding everyone of his presence with the casual menace of a loaded gun. "This family drama's touching and all, but we're here on business. The girl comes with us, Morrison, or we take payment in other ways. Your choice." Jake's hand moved toward the rifle leaning against the porch post. "Try it." Mrs. Hartwell smiled again, and this time the expression was pure venom distilled into human form. "You think you know what kind of girl you're protecting? You have no idea what other secrets she's hiding. But don't worry. Before this is over, the whole county will know exactly what she really is." Mrs. Hartwell's campaign of destruction began the very next morning, spreading through the county like wildfire through dry grass. Like a plague carried on whispered words, her poison infected every conversation, every church gathering, every moment when decent folk came together to share gossip disguised as Christian concern. "That Morrison girl," she told Mrs. Peterson at the general store, her voice dripping false sorrow. "I tried to save her soul, but some people are just born to wickedness. The things I could tell you about what goes on in the dark." She never finished the sentences, never made direct accusations. She didn't need to. The power of suggestion was far more damaging than any specific lie because it let people's own dark imaginings fill in the terrible details. By afternoon, the whispers had grown into open speculation. By evening, they'd hardened into accepted fact. Sarah Hartwell was a fallen woman. Jake Morrison was a man driven by base desires rather than Christian charity. And together, they were a corruption that threatened the moral fabric of the entire community. The economic pressure followed swiftly. Mr. Peterson regretfully informed Jake that he could no longer extend credit for supplies. The feed store owner claimed his inventory was running low. Even the blacksmith, who'd shod Jake's horses for 15 years, suddenly found his schedule too busy to accommodate another appointment. "It's nothing personal, you understand," each merchant explained with the same uncomfortable expression. "It's just, well, people talk. And when people talk, it affects business." Sarah bore the isolation like a physical weight on her shoulders. When she accompanied Jake to town, conversation stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Children were hurriedly called inside. Women crossed the street rather than share the same walkway with her. "Maybe I should confess," Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky red as blood. "Tell them I'm everything they think I am. It might free you from association with me." Jake's response was immediate and firm. "You'll do no such thing. Truth isn't something you bargain away to make cowards comfortable." But the pressure continued to mount like steam in a closed kettle. Sheriff Dawson paid another visit, this time alone, and looking thoroughly miserable about his duty. "Jake, I've got to ask you to reconsider this situation," he said, refusing the offer of coffee. "There's talk of bringing in federal marshals, maybe charging you with something under the Mann Act." "The Mann Act's about transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes," Jake replied calmly. "Sarah hasn't left Nebraska, and the only immoral thing happening here is grown men gossiping like washerwomen." "That may be, but appearances? Sheriff, you've known me since we were boys. You were at my wedding. You helped bury my wife and daughter. In all that time, have I ever given you cause to doubt my character?" Dawson's shoulders sagged under the weight of conflicting loyalties. "No, Jake, you haven't. But I'm not the only voice in this county anymore." The debt collectors, meanwhile, had taken up permanent residence at the county's only hotel, making their presence known through casual intimidation. They'd ride past the ranch at odd hours, always in sight but never close enough to justify confrontation. Their message was clear: "We're watching, we're waiting, and sooner or later, you'll make a mistake." Then came the evening when everything nearly unraveled. Sarah was preparing dinner when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. Through the window, she saw Kowalski and two of his men riding hard toward the house, their faces grim with purpose. Jake was in the barn, too far away to help if things went wrong. The debt collectors didn't dismount this time. They sat their horses in the yard like judges pronouncing sentence, and when Kowalski spoke, his voice carried the weight of ultimatum. "Morrison," he called, "time for a final discussion." Sarah stepped onto the porch, her chin high despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice. "He's not here." "That's all right, sweetheart. We can talk to you instead." Kowalski's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "See, we've been patient men, but patience has its limits. I don't know anything about Mrs. Hartwell's debts." "Oh, but you do. You're the payment she offered. One night with you, and we call her account settled." Sarah's blood turned to ice water. "I'm not her property to trade. According to the law, you belong to Morrison now, but laws can be flexible when the right pressure's applied." Just then, Jake appeared around the corner of the barn, rifle in hand. "Gentlemen, I believe you were just leaving." Kowalski's laugh was like the sound of grinding bones. "Not this time, Morrison. The whole county's gathering tomorrow night for a special church meeting. About you and your whore." The good people of Millbrook are going to decide what to do about your little arrangement. Let them try. Oh, they will. And when they do, you'll find yourself all alone against the righteous fury of Christian folk. That's when we'll collect what's owed. The church bells began ringing across the prairie, calling every soul in the county to judgment. The church was packed tighter than a coffin, every pew filled with faces twisted by righteous indignation and morbid curiosity. Sarah and Jake walked down the center aisle with quiet dignity, their footsteps echoing like funeral drums on the wooden floor. Whispers followed in their wake like autumn leaves stirred by wind. Mrs. Hartwell sat in the front pew, dressed in her finest black dress, a picture of wounded respectability. Her eyes glittered with anticipation as she watched her prey approach the altar of public judgment. Reverend Miller stood at the pulpit, his face grave with the weight of his duty. "We gather tonight to address a matter that threatens the moral foundation of our community," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed building. "Brother Morrison," he continued, "you stand accused of harboring a woman of questionable virtue in circumstances that scandalize our Christian community. What do you say to these charges?" Jake stood slowly, his weathered hands calm at his sides. "Reverend, I've harbored a young woman who needed shelter and protection. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty as charged." A murmur of disapproval rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Mrs. Hartwell rose from her pew, her voice carrying the practiced tremor of wounded virtue. "Reverend Miller, I must speak. This girl, this creature, has been nothing but corruption since the day she darkened my doorstep. I tried to save her soul, but she repaid my Christian charity with nothing but wickedness." "What wickedness?" Jake asked quietly. "She seduced my poor departed husband." Mrs. Hartwell's voice rose to a shriek. "A child of 12, leading a grown man into sin. And now she's done the same to you." The congregation erupted in shocked gasps and angry mutters. Sarah felt the weight of their judgment like stones pressing down on her chest. "That's a lie," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "Is it?" Mrs. Hartwell's eyes blazed with malicious triumph. "Then explain why my husband left you money in his will. Explain why he visited your mother before you came to us. Explain why he took such special interest in your welfare." More gasps from the crowd. The trap was closing, Sarah realized. Every truth twisted into evidence of guilt, every kindness recast as proof of corruption. "Sarah never seduced anyone," Jake said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "She was a child who lost her parents and needed help. If your husband showed her kindness, it was because he had a decent heart." "Decent?" Mrs. Hartwell laughed bitterly. "He was weak and sinful, just like she is. And now she's corrupted you too, Morrison, made you forget your Christian duty for the sake of carnal pleasure." "That's enough," Sarah said, her voice suddenly strong and clear. She stood facing the congregation that had already convicted her in their hearts. "You want to know the truth? I'll tell you the truth." She reached into her dress and pulled out the letter she'd found, the one that had shattered her world. "William Hartwell was my father, my biological father. He had an affair with my mother, and when she died, he brought me to live with his wife." The church fell silent as death. "Mrs. Hartwell has spent 7 years punishing me for my father's sin. Every beating, every cruel word, every moment of suffering was because I had the misfortune to be born from an affair I had no part in creating." She turned to face Mrs. Hartwell directly. "But you want to know what real corruption looks like. I found your books. Your real books." Sarah produced a second bundle of papers from her dress, the ledgers and falsified documents she'd discovered. "For 3 years, you've been stealing from the church collection, forging bills of sale, selling cattle that belonged to your creditors." Mrs. Hartwell's face went white as winter snow. "Those are forgeries, lies." "Are they?" Sarah's voice carried the calm authority of absolute truth. "Shall we ask Mr. Peterson about the receipts you altered, or the bank about the deposits that don't match your recorded tithe contributions?" Sheriff Dawson stood slowly from his pew, his hand moving toward his badge. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to need to see those documents." "This is all lies," the widow shrieked. Desperate lies from a desperate whore. The only desperate person here is you, Sarah replied quietly. Desperate enough to sell a human being to pay gambling debts your husband left behind. Desperate enough to spread lies to destroy innocent people. Desperate enough to steal from God's own collection plate. Jake placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. That's enough, child. Truth's been spoken. Reverend Miller's voice carried across the suddenly quiet church. Mrs. Hartwell, these are serious accusations. If they're true, they're true, Sheriff Dawson said grimly, examining the papers Sarah had provided. Every one of them. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm placing you under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. As the sheriff led Mrs. Hartwell away in chains, the congregation sat in stunned silence. The righteous fury had evaporated, leaving only shame and the uncomfortable realization that they'd been ready to destroy two innocent people based on the lies of a criminal. Kowalski and his men had vanished like smoke when the truth emerged. Even debt collectors knew better than to tangle with federal charges of fraud and theft. Sarah and Jake walked out of the church together, not as the condemned, but as survivors of a trial by fire that had burned away lies and left only truth standing. 6 months later, autumn had painted the Nebraska plains in shades of gold and amber, and the Morrison Ranch hummed with the quiet contentment of honest work and peaceful hearts. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake repair the fence posts that had been damaged during the summer storms. His movements were sure and steady, the same calm competence he brought to everything he touched. The legal proceedings had moved swiftly once the evidence came to light. Mrs. Hartwell was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, with restitution ordered for the church funds and the cattle she'd illegally sold. Kowalski and his associates had fled back to Omaha when federal marshals arrived to investigate the debt collection racket. Justice has a way of catching up with folks eventually, Sheriff Dawson had told Sarah after the trial. Sometimes it takes longer than we'd like, but it gets there in the end. Sarah had been legally freed from all contracts and claims, her status as William Hartwell's daughter officially recognized by the territorial court. The small inheritance her father had left her, hidden in a bank account Mrs. Hartwell had never known about, provided enough money for a fresh start if she chose to take it. But she'd chosen to stay. The transformation in the community had been gradual but genuine. People who had whispered cruel gossip now nodded respectfully when they passed. Children who had been taught to fear her now waved shyly from behind their mothers' skirts. The church ladies who had once crossed the street to avoid her now included her in their charity work. Shame's a powerful teacher, Mrs. Henderson had said when she stopped by with a basket of fresh bread and a heartfelt apology. Makes folks examine their own hearts when they see how easily they can be led astray. Sarah had found her voice in more ways than one. She could read and write fluently now thanks to Jake's patient teaching and his well-stocked library. More importantly, she'd discovered she had a gift for helping other women who found themselves in desperate circumstances. Twice she'd ridden out with Sheriff Dawson to speak with wives whose husbands were drinking away the family savings. Once she'd testified in court on behalf of a young woman whose employer was taking liberties with her wages and her person. Her own survival had become a source of strength for others who were struggling to find their way out of dark places. You've got a calling, Reverend Miller had told her after she'd successfully convinced a desperate widow not to sell her children to pay her debts. Pain has a way of making some folks bitter, but it's made you wise. Jake had changed too, though his transformation was quieter, more subtle. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened. He smiled more easily, laughed at Sarah's attempts to teach the barn cat to fetch like a dog. The house that had been a shrine to loss became a home filled with new memories. You brought life back to this place, he told her one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of promise. Brought life back to me, too. The community's respect for Jake had deepened as well. Men who had questioned his character now sought his counsel on matters of business and family. He'd been elected to the town council, chosen specifically for his reputation as a man who would stand for what was right regardless of popular opinion. Takes real courage to do what you did, Chairman Berger had admitted during Jake's swearing-in ceremony. Most of us would have taken the easy path. The conversation that changed everything came on a crisp October evening, with the first hint of winter in the air. Sarah was mending one of Jake's shirts when he cleared his throat in the way that meant he had something important to say. "Sarah," he began, then stopped, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "What is it?" she asked gently. "I've been thinking about us, about this arrangement we have." He twisted his hat in his hands. "Folks have stopped talking, but that doesn't change the fact that you're a young woman and well, I'm not young anymore." Sarah's heart began to race. Was he having second thoughts? Had the pressure finally worn him down? "I know I'm not much to look at," Jake continued, "and I know you could have your pick of younger men if you wanted, but if you'd be willing, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." "Not out of obligation or gratitude, but because—" "Because what?" Sarah whispered. "Because I love you," he said simply. "Not like a father loves a daughter, though there's some of that too. I love you like a man loves a woman he wants to build a life with." Sarah set down her mending and crossed to where he sat. "Jake Morrison," she said, placing her hands on either side of his weathered face. "I thought you'd never ask." The wedding was small but joyful, held in the same church where they'd faced judgment months before. This time, the congregation gathered to celebrate rather than condemn. Sarah wore a simple dress she'd made herself, with lace that Mrs. Henderson had contributed and flowers that the church ladies had arranged. "Do you, Sarah, take this man to be your lawful wedded husband?" Reverend Miller asked. "I do," Sarah replied, her voice strong and sure. "With all my heart." As they exchanged rings and promises, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the auction block to the altar, from despair to hope, from survival to love freely chosen. The sunset that evening found them on their familiar porch, but everything was different now. They were no longer two wounded souls seeking shelter from the storm. They were husband and wife, partners in building something beautiful from the ruins of their past. "No regrets?" Jake asked as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warm strength of his arm around her. "None," she said. "Not a single one." Now, I've told you this story, and maybe you're thinking it's just another tale about hard times and harder choices. But if you've lived long enough, and I figure most of you listening have, you know that life has a way of testing what a man's really made of when nobody's watching and everybody's judging. See, Jake Morrison wasn't any kind of hero when this started. He was just a broken-down rancher who'd lost everything that mattered to him. But sometimes the good Lord puts somebody in your path who needs defending, and you got to choose. Turn away like it's not your concern, or step up and do what's right, even when it cost you everything you got left. Sarah learned something too, something that took her 7 years of suffering to understand. She discovered that being damaged don't mean being worthless, that kindness ain't always got a price tag attached to it, and that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. Every person, doesn't matter how low they've been brought or how little they got, every single soul has worth that can't be bought or sold or whipped away. Takes real strength to see that worth when the whole world's calling it worthless. Takes even more strength to stand up and defend it when standing up means standing alone. The deepest kind of love don't need a lot of words. It shows up in how you treat somebody when they can't do nothing for you back, in how you stand by them when everybody else walks away, in choosing to see their dignity when they can't see it themselves. Sometimes doing right don't feel like winning. Sometimes it costs you everything you thought you wanted. But a man can sleep peaceful knowing he chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over fear. If this old story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own choices, your own chances to stand up for somebody who needed defending, well, maybe it's worth remembering. Maybe worth sharing with someone else who needs to hear that dignity ain't negotiable and kindness ain't weakness. Some stories stick with you long after the telling's done. Those are the ones that matter most.